So what does it really take to rebuild a nation? Is it just about bricks and mortar, or is it something deeper? We're about to jump into the incredible story of the Jewish return from exile in Babylon, and it's a tale that unfolds in two very distinct acts. First, you have the rebuilding of a temple, and then, decades later, the rebuilding of a community's very soul. Here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the exile itself to get the lay of the land. Then we'll dive into that first return, which was basically a massive construction project. After that, we'll look at the long, quiet intermission that followed and why it led to a second, much more spiritual return. And finally, we'll unpack the blueprint for restoration that's kind of hidden inside this whole story. All right, let's set the scene. Imagine this. It's the 6th century BC. The kingdom of Judah has been totally conquered by the Babylonian Empire. Its people, they've been ripped from their homes and deported. They're literally a people without a country, without their temple, living as foreigners in a strange land. But the crazy thing is, this wasn't some random disaster. As you can see right here, their own sacred texts had warned for centuries that if they strayed from their laws, this exact thing could happen. So the problem wasn't just political, it was deeply spiritual. It was a sign of a disconnect from their God and from their own identity. This timeline really gives us the bird's eye view. Notice that first return way back in 538 BC to build the temple. But then, look at that huge gap before the second return in 458 BC. That 58-year pause is absolutely crucial. It's the whole reason this story needed a second act. And then, something totally impossible happens. The Babylonians get conquered by the Persians. And the new king, Cyrus the Great, does something no one saw coming. He issues a decree not just allowing, but actually encouraging the exiled Jews to go back to their homeland and rebuild their temple. For people who'd lost all hope, this was just an unbelievable miracle. And that kicks off what we can call the first solution. This was a physical mission, a hands-on project with a super clear goal: get the house of God, the very center of their national and spiritual life, back up and standing. So, in response to the king's decree, nearly 50,000 Jews made that long, tough journey back home to Judah. They were led by a man named Zerubbabel, and they had one single-minded goal: get the temple rebuilt. When they finally laid the foundation for the new temple, the sound was this wild, confusing mix of weeping and cheering. The younger folks, they were shouting for joy at this amazing new beginning. But the older generation, the ones who could actually remember the glory of the first temple, they wept because they knew what had been lost. It was this powerful moment of hope, all tangled up with sorrow. But of course, it couldn't be that easy, right? This new hope runs smack into a giant roadblock. The people who had settled in the land while the Jews were in exile, a mix of all kinds of cultures, they saw this rebuilding project as a major threat. They did not want a strong, revitalized Jewish nation right on their doorstep. And their opposition was, well, it was effective. They used discouragement, threats, and a ton of political red tape to bring the construction to a dead stop. For 16 long years, that foundation just sat there, unfinished. All that initial energy and hope just completely fizzled out. And this opposition was clever, They used a whole playbook of tactics. First came the sneaky offer to help, which was really just a power play. When that got shot down, it escalated to straight-up threats. Then came the legal challenges, designed to just wear them down. At every single turn, they had to dig deep and find a new way to keep going. So what finally broke the deadlock? It was really a 1-2 punch. First, 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, showed up and lit a fire under the people, reminding them to put God's house first. And second, a new Persian king, Darius, actually looked through the royal archives, found Cyrus's original decree, and gave the project his full stamp of approval. He even told the opposition to back off and help pay for it. With that kind of momentum, both divine and political, the temple was finally finished and dedicated in 515 BC. And get this, that date is huge because it was exactly 70 years after the first temple was destroyed, just as the prophet Jeremiah had predicted. So, Act 1 is complete. The building was standing. But this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. We hit that 58-year gap between the temple being finished and the next part of the story. And in that long silence, a new, much sneakier problem started to grow. Think about it, during this long stretch of time, a whole new generation was born and grew up. For them, the temple was just there. It had always been there. But as they were about to find out, just having the building wasn't nearly enough to fix the deeper issue. And here it is, the big twist in the story. The physical building was there, a monument to their return. But the spiritual foundation of the community, it was crumbling from the inside. This new generation started intermarrying with their neighbors, adopting all kinds of foreign practices, and blurring the very lines that defined who they were. The problem wasn't an enemy outside the gates anymore, it was inside their own homes. This new crisis needed a whole new kind of solution. It wasn't going to be led by a builder or a governor, but by a priest and a scribe, a scholar named Ezra. His mission had nothing to do with architecture. It was all about spiritual and social reform. This one verse, right here, tells you everything you need to know about Ezra. The man was completely devoted to the law. But notice the order. It's key. First, he studied it for himself. Second, he actually lived it out in his own life. And only then, third, did he set out to teach it to others. That's where his real authority came from. And once again, a Persian king plays a massive role. King Artaxerxes basically gives Ezra his full support to lead a second, smaller group of about 5,000 people back to Judah. And this wasn't just a move. It was an officially sanctioned rescue mission for the nation's identity. The authority the king gave him was just immense. Ezra was empowered to investigate the community, set up judges, teach the law, and even punish people who disobeyed it, with penalties all the way up to death. He was basically tasked with rebooting the entire social and legal system based on their ancient laws. So when Ezra finally arrives and finds out just how widespread this intermarriage problem is, that it goes all the way to the top leadership, his reaction is just completely visceral. He tears his clothes, he pulls out hair from his head and his beard, and he just collapses in utter shock. Because for Ezra, this wasn't just breaking some rule. This was repeating the exact same behavior that led to the exile in the first place. He was watching history repeat itself. This crisis led to a really dramatic and painful solution, a public confession of sin and a commitment to dissolve these marriages. And out of that incredibly difficult process, a really clear blueprint for true restoration emerges. It all comes back to Ezra's personal playbook, right? Real renewal, whether it's for an ancient nation or for any of us, seems to follow this pattern. First, you have to deeply understand your foundational principles. You study. Second, you have to actually live them out yourself. You observe. And only then can you effectively teach and lead the community around you. And all of this leaves us with a final question. What does it take to rebuild a community? Strong walls or strong beliefs? The first return built the temple, the strong walls. But it wasn't enough. The second return had to rebuild the people's commitment to their beliefs. This whole story seems to argue that while a physical center is important, the real foundation of any community is the shared convictions that hold its people together.